Attention Navia fans!
Navia enjoyers? Navia simps? Naviators. Yeah, let's go with that. Navia is getting released in patch 4.3, and this is huge because she's the first new GEO character we're getting in over a year. But let's get the big question out of the way first. Will she save GEO? Well, no, it's more like she's jumping ship and doing her own thing with the element, and if she ends up being strong, she'll enjoy it alone while leaving the element itself in the sorry state that it is. What she will save though is the other GEO. That's me. My name is GEO. White girl, save me. White girl, save me, white girl. Anyway, in this video, we're gonna look at Navia's kit and how you should build her. But first, a few disclaimers. I'm not a theory crafter, nor am I working with any, so the information in this video won't be 100% accurate, but I'd say it's still good enough for you to get a general sense of everything. At the time of this video, Navia is still an unreleased character, so all this will be beta information, and for obvious reasons, I won't be able to show any gameplay footage of her. So enjoy some background footage of Best Girl instead. This is also my first time making a guide on an unreleased character, so please take everything in this video with a grain of salt. So, why did I choose to make a video on Navia, you might ask? Well, it's because she's fucking hot. Alright, let's get into her kit now. Navia is a 5-star claymore wielding character who uses the GEO element, which is fitting because she goes hard like a rock. But not as hard as she makes my cut. She has 12,650 base HP, which is around the middle range, a base attack stat of 352, which will be the highest in the game after she comes out, with Xiao coming in at second place. She has 793 base defense, which is a bit on the higher end, and she ascends with crit damage, so building crit ratio on her will be easier than most other characters. Her kit revolves around using the Crystallize reaction, which we can look further into through her talents. Her normal side combo is a string of 4 attacks, with the third attack being a triple hit where she kicks her weapon forward and it spins like Zhongli's spear. Except while Zhongli's animation is dog shit useless, in Navia's case it actually matters and it's not just for aesthetics only. We'll come back to that later. Her charged and plunging attacks are just the typical ones for Claymore characters, nothing really worth talking about. Her skill is where most of her damage comes from. It has a passive effect of granting Navia 1 charge of crystal shrapnel every time someone in the party picks up a Crystallize shard, with a max of 6 charges. This effect doesn't seem to have a cooldown, so it seems you could get multiple charges quickly in AoE where you can trigger Crystallize on multiple enemies. These charges last 5 whole minutes for whatever reason. Oh, even I last longer than... and getting a new charge will refresh the duration of all charges. Tapping her skill causes her to consume all charges and become American. She fires her... gunbrella. No, that's literally what it's called. It fires multiple projectiles called Rosula shard shots in a single shot, kinda like a shotgun, and the number of shard shots depends on the number of crystal shrapnel charges she has. These Rosula shard shots can penetrate enemies, dealing GEO damage to all enemies hit. At base, it shoots 5 shard shots and increases by 2 for every shrapnel charge, to a max of 11 for 3 charges, and every additional charge is converted into a 15% damage bonus, so 45% at max. Holding the skill enters aiming mode and collects nearby crystallized shards, and releasing it will produce the same effect as tapping the skill. She can't aim upwards though. This skill has a 9-second cooldown and has 2 charges, which means you can use it twice in a 20-second rotation without having to use it 9 seconds apart. Casting the skill will also summon a Surging Blade, which deals Usia-aligned GEO damage, but it has a separate cooldown so it won't always trigger on every skill cast. Like all Arca attacks, this Surging Blade has no elemental application, so it won't trigger Crystallize. This skill generates an average of 3.5 GEO particles upon hitting. So just like a shotgun in an FPS game, the more projectiles that hit a single enemy, the more damage it does. I've done some research and it seems that the number shown here refers to the total damage of the base 5 shots, and the skill indicates that hitting all 11 shots deals double the damage of that of the base 5 shots. So that means the damage doesn't scale linearly with the number of shots that hit. And we don't have exact damage values for the numbers of shots in between. This interpretation does make more sense though, as the motion value for the base damage is already pretty big. If we go with the other interpretation, and the number here refers to the damage of every individual shard shot, and the damage is further doubled on top of every shot landing, one skill cast alone would be able to do Navillion damage. Her burst costs 60 energy and has a cooldown of 15 seconds. Upon casting, she pulls out her massive badonkadonks. By that I mean her cannons. Actual cannons. It does 1 instance of AoE GEO damage and launches cannonballs at enemies for the next 12 seconds for a total of 16 times dealing GEO damage. When these cannon attacks hit, Navia gains a shrapnel charge with a cooldown of 2.4 seconds. Since it doesn't line up perfectly with the cannonball timings, I can only assume you get 5 charges from the burst alone. The burst doesn't do very much damage, and its crystal shrapnel gain combined with its additional GEO application to trigger Crystallize will allow Navia to quickly gain charges to boost her skill damage, so it's a burst that you want to be able to use every rotation. In a double GEO team, she'll typically need around 130 to 140% ER, but may increase or decrease depending on your team, equipment, and constellations, which we'll touch on later. Navia's first Ascension passive converts her auto attack damage into GEO damage after casting her skill, and increases the damage by 40% for 4 seconds. This is why the triple hit from her third normal attack matters here. If you use an N3-N2 combo with her Geo-infused auto attacks, she performs a total of 7 hits, which results in 3 Geo applications, triggering Crystallize 1 more time than just 2 with her full normal attack string. The additional damage bonus for her auto attacks is a nice little buff, and it's another reason to play her on field, which I'm glad about, so I can, look at her for longer. The short duration also makes her more flexible than other on-fielders like Ryze and Yoimiya, allowing her to split her field time to switch out and back in to cast her skill's second charge and do her autos again. Her 4th Ascension passive gives her 20% attack for every party member of an element that can react with Geo and trigger Crystallize. This caps at 2 party members, so it leaves a space for a second Geo character, which is great because Geo resonance is a big deal for Geo teams. So her damage distribution for talents should look something like this, with her skill making up about half of her personal damage, making it the highest priority for leveling. Then you can level her normal attack, then her burst last. But if you're base, you'll crown all 3 of her talents regardless. I want to talk about her constellations first before moving on to equipment, so free-to-play players, feel free to skip this part. C1 restores up to 9 energy to Navia every time she casts her skill, depending on the number of crystal shrapnel charges consumed. But since you'll usually want to cast it at max charges anyway, you'll get the max energy gain, and her skill should be used twice per rotation, so that's 18 energy restored per rotation. This by itself doesn't increase her damage, but it significantly lowers her energy requirement so you can invest more into damage-focused stats. The cooldown reduction for her burst is also nice, but since you want to line up your burst cast with your rotation anyway, it's not that big of a deal. C2 increases the crit rate of 1 skill shot by 12% for each shrapnel charge consumed in the skill cast, up to 36%. Again, you'll typically get the maximum effect from this, but the crit rate boost only applies to your skill and nothing else. And since crit rate has a cap of 100%, you'll have to cap your normal crit rate at 64% to get the most out of this constellation, and that'll make the other parts of her kit more inconsistent. It's worth a trade-off since her skill is her biggest source of damage, but it's still only about half. Personally, I think it would be better if the buff was crit damage instead, as it's just a direct damage buff that doesn't require any build readjustments, but it's pretty nice for an early constellation. The other part of this con triggers a cannonball shot from her burst when her skill hits, a little bonus damage in Geo application, which is nice. C3 increases her elemental skill level. It's her biggest source of damage, and since she doesn't do damage directly through elemental reactions, she's heavily reliant on talent damage, so her C3 is a nice boost. C4 decreases the Geo res of enemies hit by her burst by 20% for 8 seconds. This is also a nice constellation because Geo res decrease is very rare, with the only other sources being Geo Resonance and Zhongli's Jade Shield, which decreases all resistances, so I don't even think it counts. This constellation is even more valuable if you're not using Zhongli and you're missing out on his resistance debuff, and instead using someone like Albedo. Using Albedo as your second Geo character, because that means 1 more damage dealer will benefit from this constellation. C5 increases her burst level. Her burst is important, but less so for its damage, so while it's a nice little buff, it's not a big deal for her overall damage. It would have been better if it increased her normal attack talent level instead, considering that it's not a new concept anymore with the release of Fontanian characters. Yoimiya deserved the same treatment, by the way. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a stupid YouTuber trying to tell you what to do with your character builds. C6 is her best constellation, giving her a massive damage buff. When casting her skill, every shrapnel charge consumed beyond the first 3 will give the shot a 45% crit damage bonus. At max charges, you're looking at a grand total of, 135%? On top of that, all of those extra charges are returned to her. So that means after the first cast, you only need to pick up 3 Crystallize shards, which is just half compared to non-C6, to max out her charges every single time, to get that 135% crit damage boost every single time. That's a pretty good C6. Overall, her constellations are pretty good across the board except for her C5, but Navia seems fully functional without needing to rely on constellations to feel complete. Remember, 5-star constellations are just luxuries you can go for if you have extra wishes or funds to spare, just to entertain yourself with bigger numbers. Moving on to weapons, her best in slot is her signature weapon, Verdict. That's such a lame name. It's an axe, so throughout this video, I'll just call it the axe. The axe has high base attack and a low crit rate substat, which nicely complements Navia's crit damage ascension stat. The passive gives an unconditional 20% attack buff, which is nice due to both it and Navia's high base attack. And also 18% damage bonus for her elemental skill when a party member picks up a Crystallize shard, which lasts 15 seconds and can stack 2 times. The buff disappears after her skill deals damage, but it doesn't matter since it's just 1 hit anyway. The condition for the damage bonus should probably be able to be fulfilled even when Navia is off the field, even though it isn't stated, because it just requires any character in the party to pick up the shards, and not the user specifically, but I guess we'll have to wait for testing. For other 5-star weapons, the Beacon is a fine stat stick. Other than that, the first attack buff only triggers after her skill hits, which means only her second skill if the rotation will be buffed. And the second attack buff only happens when she takes damage, which can happen when your Crystallize shields inevitably break because they're so bad, but you want to keep replenishing your shields so you won't get the HP boost. Okay, but like who the fuck actually has this weapon anyway? I'd say Redhorn Stone Thrusher is surprisingly one of the better weapons for Navia. Or maybe I'm just biased because I have it and I quite like the weapon. It buffs her defense and adds a bit of defense scaling to her auto attacks. Not that you should build her for defense, but it makes all the defense stats you passively got less useless. And since her auto attacks have multi-hit, you get even more value from flat damage buffs. By following the combo I mentioned previously, it'll apply to 7 hits. It only buffs auto attacks and nothing else though, so it's not top tier, but it does make her auto attacks take up a slightly bigger portion of her overall damage output. So it's a great option for those of you who are on-field Navia believers. Oh yeah, it has a massive crit damage stat too. The only remaining 5-star weapons that I think are worth mentioning are Wolf's Gravestone and the Unforged, both being massive attack stat sticks. Gravestone offers a huge attack buff with a smaller conditional team-wide attack buff, while the Unforged has better synergy with Navia's Crystallize centered gameplay due to benefiting from having a shield. Both of these weapons are still pretty bad in general though compared to the other options, and even worse when you have other attack buffs. Navia has some great 4-star options as well, and while they're not as strong as her 5-star options, it's mainly because of their lower base attack. So the difference between 4-star and 5-star weapons can be shrunk by using an attack buffer like... well, who else? Bennett again. Her best 4-star option is the Serpent Spine because, well, you can never really go wrong with Serpent Spine. I just wish you would use my spine though. We all know how strong Serpent Spine is, and at R5 while being buffed by Bennett, it can even be stronger than her signature weapon. That probably won't stop me from trying to pull for it though. We're getting a new 4-star Claymore for free. It has a high base attack and an ER substat, and a passive that buffs attack based on the number of Melusines you've helped in the open world. At max buff, it's pretty good, and the ER substat allows you to invest more into damage stats in your artifacts. It's a good free-to-play option. The Fontaine Craftable Claymore is also a decent stat stick if you have a consistent healer to keep proccing the attack buff passive. Talking stick. No. It's just a bad weapon. It has a low crit stat, and while it has high base attack, the only part of the passive that you can control is the Pyro status, which gives a decent attack buff, but the only consistent way to get the effect is by using Bennett, who, you know, makes the weapon's high attack and attack buff less valuable. So there's just not really a point. It's usable, but the fact that you need to buy the battle pass and choose this weapon 5 times just for it to be on par with free-to-play weapons is not a good thing. Why does this weapon even exist? Attack has high base attack and a pretty good ER stat, similarly to the Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword. It has the potential to give you 1 more skill usage, but at low refinement, it's way too inconsistent, so I don't recommend using it. It's more consistent at high refinements, but it's still RNG, and there are many factors depending on your rotations and how you time your skills. So all I can say is, it's good for memes. I guess the last weapon that's barely worth mentioning is Fav. Fav is good in general, but I don't like the idea of Fav on Navia. It has low base attack which can hurt her damage, and she's not energy hungry to the point of needing that high ER substat. In my opinion, it's better to use damage focused weapons on her. Here's a chart for comparing damage between weapons. Please take these numbers with a grain of salt because they're not absolute, and actual damage values will depend on the situation. And these numbers are the result of conditions under the assumption stated above, with this rotation. Also, there will be mistakes because I'm not a theory crafter, hence the disclaimers at the start of the video. And yes, even though I'm Asian, I'm not a mess guy. We exist. Okay, that was a little bit racist. Regardless, you can use this chart as a general guideline to get an idea of what you should use. The same applies to artifacts, so I won't be repeating this. Okay, so artifacts are pretty straightforward. Navia wants the standard main stats for any typical damage dealer. Attack Sands, Geo Damage Goblet, and Crit Circlet. There's nothing to really look out for here. For substats, as mentioned previously, you'll want to reach her ER requirement of 130 to 140% in double Geo teams, and if you're considering playing her as a solo Geo, don't? You psychopath. After that, other substats you want to aim for are crit and attack percent. Defense percent stats are fine too if she's using Redhorn, but other stats are still more valuable. Because of Navia's high base attack, especially if she's using the axe, she tends to appreciate attack percent stats more than other characters, if you're not already using external buffs like the Tenacity set or Bennett. This applies to substats as well as set bonuses, which is a perfect segue into her Best in Slot artifact set, which is a new set coming out in the same patch as Navia herself. The 2B set gives 18% attack, which is nice, and the 4B set gives the user 20% Geo damage bonus for 10 seconds upon casting their skill. If the user has a Crystallize shield at any point within this time, the effect increases by 150%. Alright, I know most people know what this means, but it can be misleading to some, so let me just clarify that it's the 20% Geo damage bonus effect that gets increased by 150%. So it goes from 20% to 50% Geo damage bonus. This extra bonus disappears 1 second after losing the Crystallized shield, so you have an incentive to keep the shield intact, or you can simply get a new one. Yes, it has to be a Crystallized shield specifically. I honestly don't know if EM stats matter at all in making the shields more durable, but knowing how dogshit they are, I'd say probably not. Unless it's created by a full EM build. Regardless, it's Navia's best set because it buffs her damage across her whole kit. and it synergizes with her Crystallize playstyle. Another great 4-piece set is Golden Troop because of its massive buff to skill damage, which is Navia's biggest source of damage. Though it's not as good as the new set because Navia's skill only makes up half of her damage, and this set buffs literally nothing else. There are a few things to keep in mind. While the max buff is mostly only active while the user is off the field, it doesn't immediately disappear upon swapping in. Instead, you get a 2-second grace period. Since Navia's skill is just a single hit, you can get all of its damage out within those 2 seconds and get the max buff. However, you gotta swap out in the middle of her field time to gain the buff again, before swapping in to use her skill for a second time. But that shouldn't be a problem because she has the freedom to swap out anyway. Another caveat is that the rotation that I previously brought up won't be as practical because judging by her burst animation, it's unlikely she can do QE within the 2-second grace period, so she'll have to do EQ instead, which causes her burst animation to eat into her Geo Infusion uptime, and that's a whole ass other problem. But anyway, I'm just kinda feels crafting here. I guess you can kinda do it like a Shimenawa Yoimiya where you use her burst before cycling through your teammates. Regardless, Golden Troop is good for big PP damage on her gun, and it's still a really strong set on her. The Maheshose Hunter set can be good on her if you're using her with Furina, but I don't really see them working well together, which I'll touch on later in the team comp section. For now, I don't recommend farming the set for her, but if she does end up working well with Furina in the future, this will be an excellent set. As for the remaining sets, 2-piece combinations will do. You can take pieces from sets including Attack % 2-piece sets, Arcade Petra, and Golden Troop. Here's a damage comparison chart. Don't mind the 4-piece Refreshing Bolide, I calculated that set for fun. I mean, hey, it could probably work with Red Horn. Alright, moving on to team comps. Not gonna lie, I don't think Navia has an absolute best team comp. I guess there's a general template you can use for the base of a team. You'll want a second Geo character because Geo Resonance is great for teams centered around Geo damage, and for the 2 other slots, as mentioned before, you want those characters to have elements that Geo can trigger Crystallize on. And ideally, one of them is an off-field elemental applicator so you can generate shards consistently. Here's a sample team I came up with. Wait, why is it you 3 again? Yes, okay, alright. We have 3 of the most overused characters in the game. Big surprise, I know. Let me explain. Zhongli is here for Geo Resonance, and he can use the 4-piece Tenacity set to buff Navia's attack, which is nice. And also Shield Strength. You know, just that little boost to try to keep that Crystallized shield from breaking, assuming she's using the new artifact set. Yes, even with Zhongli's shield, you still need to make the Crystallized shield stronger because some genius at Hoyo made it so that multiple shields don't stack, and they all take full damage simultaneously. Zhongli's Jade Shield is also nice for the only source of Geo Res Shred other than Geo Resonance. The Geo application from his pillars isn't crazy, but it's something that can help with creating shards. Well, if they don't break. Xingqiu can apply a lot of Hydro for both Navia and Zhongli to trigger Crystallize on. His Rainsword damage reduction can also help the Crystallized shield last longer. Bennett is there for attack buff. Pretty straightforward. And healing if you need it. I guess we can use this team as a base and start replacing characters. You can always replace Xingqiu with Yelan if you don't mind missing out on his damage reduction and faster Hydro application, but hey, your Navia can deal more damage. Replacing Zhongli with Albedo is another option for more off-field damage and Crystallized shards, allowing you to quickly replenish your shield. But you may or may not have enough application from your other elements for it to matter though. That being said, someone like Xingqiu or Yelan should generally have enough application because Geo has a weak application on all 4 of these elements, so you can generate quite many shards if you have fast enough Geo application. Just, you know, avoid a shit ton of Geo application in a single hit like Zhongli's Burst because that would just wipe out a lot of the aura while giving you barely any shards. I don't see Goro being a good pick for the second Geo slot, because with only 2 Geo characters on the team, you only get access to level 2 of his buffs, only boosting defense, which doesn't benefit Navia's damage. Well, unless you're using Red Horn. His burst has some Geo application to help with Crystallized procs, but it's nothing special compared to the other off-field Geo characters. There can be an argument to use him at C6. With double Geo, you get a 20% crit damage boost to all your Geo damage, so that might be a good reason to use him. If you have enough attack buffs on Navia and feel like you don't need Bennett, you can maybe use an off-field Electro Charge pair like Xingqiu and Fischl. This will create coexisting Electro and Hydro auras so you can have more auras to trigger Crystallize on if you have a lot of Geo app. You have quite a lot of options here. Whether you want to have your elemental applicators also be damage dealers, or have them only be pure supports to focus on buffing Navia's personal damage. Or Yelan, who's both. Similarly to Ito though, while Navia does want enemies to group up because her AoE isn't very big, Anemo characters generally don't synergize well with Geo-centered teams, on top of Anemo not being one of the elements that fulfill the condition for Navia's 4th Ascension passive. It could be worth a trade-off in damage depending on the situation and enemies you're facing, but typically I don't think Anemo groupers should be used with her. I want to take some time to talk about Furina being a teammate for Navia specifically because holy shit! When I was looking for Navia's damage calculations for reference, the only few that I looked into all included Furina as a teammate. Because wow, universal damage buff good! Yeah, of course you're gonna have good damage when your teammates are Furina and Bennett, but have fun trying to replicate what you just did after the first rotation when your whole team is on half HP, dipshit. Don't get me wrong, the damage buff part of Furina's kit is good for Navia, considering that Navia can't benefit from something like a Kazuha buff, but there aren't many good ways for Navia's teams to deal with the other part of Furina's kit. Like, you know, the team-wide HP drain. Well, unless Furina is C6. Furina also comes with her own energy issues, so you're incentivized to use a second Hydro character. So the team will be something like a double Geo and double Hydro team, but neither of these two elements has a character who can heal the whole team without wanting field time. Barbara doesn't count, by the way, she doesn't generate particles. There could be a future character who can fulfill these conditions, but as it stands right now, you'll have to significantly sacrifice Furina's damage just for her to be a good support for Navia's team, and I don't think that's worth it because Furina's damage is actually pretty relevant when she's not forced to build more ER. And even if she wasn't, this kind of team doesn't have anything buffing her damage. Animal characters don't fit here, and she's the only Hydro, so no VV debuff, no Hydro resonance, and no bitches. Lastly, I want to mention some team equipment. Because of Navia's high base attack, and especially if you're using a high base attack weapon like her signature, she'll benefit quite a lot from teammates using support equipment that gives team attack buffs like 4-piece Tenacity as mentioned before, 4-piece Noblesse, and TTDS among others. Using double Pyro for Pyro Resonance can help too with its attack buff, especially if you're using Bennett Xiangling or something cringe like that. I guess that wraps up the team comp section. Again, she doesn't really have an absolute best team. It all depends on how invested she and your other characters are to find out the best team for you. Huh? Hey, do you hear that? Wait, no! So if you use a 3-character Hyper Bloom core, you can slot in Navia, and because all the other characters can function off-field, Navia can stay on-field attacking and look absolutely stunning while doing it. And it doesn't fucking matter what she does because the whole team will put out a shit ton of damage anyway. Fucking Hyper Bloom. That about wraps up this guide. Again, this is all beta information, so we'll need to actually do some testing when she comes out to know how good she actually is in practice. I personally will be pulling for Navia and I'll try to get her weapon too. I'll test her out and may or may not make a follow-up video. Who knows really. But if you're interested in that, or if you enjoyed the video, do me a little favor and leave a like. Subscribe and click the bell to get notified from our future content, and you can also become a member to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I wish you all the best in pulling for Navia. Bye!